Welcome everybody, and today I'm going to give you some tips and advice as to how you can choose the best equipment for you for wildlife photography. Now there's so many things I could talk about on this topic, so many lens and camera combinations, but the first thing I would do is encourage you to think about what kind of photography do you tend to do and what you want to do moving forward. So for example, are you someone who likes to walk about and take pictures in that way, more opportunistic style, or do you prefer to just go to one place and sit there in a hide, for example? Maybe spend a lot of time photographing deep in the forest or in other low light situations, like either end of the day when your subject's most active. All of these things are going to have a bearing on what is the best equipment for you specifically. So if you try and bear these things in mind, it's going to help you when you come to make your decision. Weight. This is often overlooked, but it is pretty important. So if you're going to be carrying camera gear around for wildlife photography, then you need to know you're going to be able to handle that. Maybe you want to travel more often, or maybe you have a disability even, or an injury, something that you don't want to aggravate that prevents you from carrying really heavy gear. So you can obviously look online and you can read about cameras and lenses, but you don't get a feel of how heavy it actually is. So I would advise you as much as possible to actually feel the weight of it in the hand before you buy it, and then you know if you're going to be able to handle it out in the field. Next up is autofocus capability. Now I would put this really high on my list of priorities. I think it's really crucial that the autofocus on the system is both fast and accurate. So whatever you're photographing, there's always going to be situations where the subject's moving quickly, or perhaps the bird or an animal is behind some foliage or some twigs, which can confuse the autofocus system. So it does need to be pretty good. Now I used to think years ago I would always err on the side of spending my money on the lens rather than the camera body. These days I think it's equaled up a bit more with some of the modern camera bodies. I don't necessarily think that is the case. I would also look at ease of use. So here I mean just kind of finding your way around the camera, being able to change settings that you regularly change, kind of how easy it is to adjust things and whether it's comfortable for you. So for me personally, it's really important that I can keep my eye to the viewfinder. I don't want to have to be going into menus and clicking on buttons to change things I use regularly. So for things like exposure compensation, focus points, maybe a focus lock, for example, I want to be able to change all those things while still keeping my eye glued to the viewfinder, so I don't want to miss anything, and a lot of the time I don't want that movement to disturb the wildlife. Definitely look to see if the camera has some kind of silent shutter option. Now for years we didn't really have this, but now we have this with lots of mirrorless cameras, which is fantastic. Obviously it can make a big difference in terms of not spooking the subjects you're trying to photograph. So there are ways around this if your shutter is noisy, but if you can, it definitely is a big advantage, particularly on mirrorless cameras, or if you're on a DSLR, then maybe a silent shutter option. Try and check what is the maximum frame rate, the maximum continuous frame rate that the camera will do. Now you don't have to have necessarily the fastest frame rate, but if you've got something like 3 frames a second, then that's probably not going to cut it. You're probably going to end up getting frustrated and wanting more eventually anyway. So I would say for a lot of shooters out there, not doing it on a professional basis, if your camera does say between 5 and 10 frames a second, I think that's pretty reasonable. And think about low light capability as well. How good does the camera perform in terms of noise levels once you start to increase the ISO? Now there are ways around this in terms of technique and using noise reduction software afterwards, but if you can, it can really help in certain situations. So again, this is more personal, I would say. If you're someone who's regularly photographing subjects, maybe like owls and deer that are active in fairly low light, then it will be something that's important for you. Now I couldn't get through this video without talking a little bit about full frame cameras versus crop sensor cameras. Now this is something I've never spent a huge amount of time on, so I'm definitely by no means an expert, but really I think the main argument is it better to have a crop sensor camera or to have a full frame camera that you then crop down to a similar size? That's often the argument which is best, and I think, to be honest, the main thing is it's to do with megapixels. So a lot of it is to do with the size of the megapixels megapixel as to how good it's going to be. So that's image quality. The second thing is in terms of noise at high ISOs, and here I think the full frame cameras win out. The pixels of full frame are bigger, therefore they deal better in low light situations. One thing to bear in mind, which is important, is that if you have a lens for a full frame camera, you can put it onto a crop sensor camera body, but you can't do the opposite way round. So that means it might be better moving forward to invest in a lens that's designed for full frame. So how do you decide what is the best lens for you? Well, you need to think about what is probably going to be the most useful focal length for the type of photography you do. And that'll depend to an extent how close you can get to your subject. So if you think you can get really close, then a 300mm lens might be enough. If you think you're always going to be further away, then a 500, even a 600mm is probably going to be better for you. Also think about the size of the subject, because an elk, for example, you won't need to get as close to that to photograph it as you would a blue tit. In terms of how fast the focus needs to be, the lens does need to be pretty good in terms of speed and accuracy, but you don't necessarily have to buy the top end lenses that cost the most amount of money. That said, you are probably not going to get a fast enough lens if you're just spending a couple of £100. Definitely consider weight. This is where most of the weight comes in with the telephoto lens. If it's really, really heavy, you might need to use a tripod, which means then that you've got to invest some more money on more equipment as well. Again, think about if you're going to be shooting in low light, because if you are definitely going to be shooting a lot in low light, then you're probably going to need a lens with a fairly wide aperture, and that is definitely going to cost you more money. Can you use extenders? Is it possible for you to use a smaller lens and pair that up with an extender? This can work well, I'd say particularly more really with prime lenses rather than zoom lenses, is my opinion. So this can work well, but the only problem with this, I think, is that you never really have a very big focal length. So if your kind of default position is to use a smaller lens with an extender, then it never gives you that option for really big reach, as opposed to having, say, a 500mm, which is your usual lens. And then if you want to add an extender onto that, say a 1.4 extender, for example, then you've got a massive 700mm. So that's definitely something to bear in mind. And I almost forgot about image stabilization. This is often another argument whether you need to have it or not. What I'd say is, if you're photographing if you live in a country where you're photographing constantly with bright sun and blue skies and high shutter speeds, then do you really need image stabilization? I would argue that you probably don't. However, if you're photographing in more dreary conditions and maybe you have shaky hands, for example, maybe you even have a tremor, then that's something where image stabilization is going to be better for you. So you might have noticed so far in this video, I haven't mentioned anything about specific equipment, any specific brands, cameras, lenses, and that's because I didn't want this video to be about specific gear. I wanted it to be really about the best gear for you and for your needs. So we're going to come now to camera bodies. So how do you decide on the camera body? Well, again, I would consider size and weight. This is not going to be as important as the lens, but it can still help to a degree if it's less to carry around and smaller, more compact. One of the main things again is the autofocus. Now the lens is going to be hugely important for autofocus capability, but the camera is going to have some degree of impact as well. Now particularly with modern mirrorless cameras, got some amazing tracking autofocus features with eye and animal tracking. Some of those are just absolutely fantastic. So the camera body can now make, I think, more of a difference in terms of the autofocus than in the past. Also, again, consider, we talked about noise earlier. How good is the noise capability? Again, this is going to be really important if you're shooting in low light. And sometimes it's difficult to know how good it is. So for this, you might want to try one out, or at least look at some example images which are cropped down, zoomed in, so you can see how much the noise actually is. Look at ease of use. How easy is it to find your way around the camera, which is kind of the ease of use or the ergonomics. And also, this is one that I think is often overlooked, is how robust is the camera. This is one that's really important to me personally. That shape that should be round is no longer quite round. Now the camera might be all singing or dancing, fantastic, but how well does it stand up in difficult conditions? For wildlife photography, you're going to be out in the field, certainly 99% of the time I would say, and it has to be able to cope. So can your camera cope with different weather conditions, humidity? Can it cope on the beach, for example, if you're taking it on the beach and potential sand, or maybe even going to take it to the Antarctic, is it going to be able to cope with that? So that is something I think that's overlooked, but it's really important that the camera is fairly robust. Now, image quality, again, you'll notice I've mentioned nothing about this in the entire video up until this sentence. And that is because for me personally, I would put many other things above it. So I would put the size and weight, the autofocus, the high ISO capability, and probably usability. I would put those all above really high megapixels. So in terms of megapixels, which is what we're largely talking about with image quality, I mean, for me personally, I think 20 megapixels is enough. And if you're going to be just posting images online or even on YouTube, for example, then you don't really need to have a massive amount of megapixels. Now, if you're making huge prints, really, really big prints for people's walls, for example, or you're doing specific things on a professional basis, then megapixels is going to be more important. But I think a lot of people get hung up on this. And personally, I think there's so many more things that I rate as more important. I just wouldn't obsess as much about the megapixels. Now, we all know that wildlife photography equipment is by no means cheap, so you're going to have to work within your budget. One thing I would say is that when you get to a certain point where you've got really, really good gear, I would ask yourself the question, does it make sense to spend thousands and thousands of pounds more in order to get potentially a little bit of improvement? Now, for some people it will, for some people it won't, but it's definitely a good question to ask. If your gear is already pretty good, how much improvement are you actually going to see for your money, and is it worth it for you? It's all relative. Do you think it's worth it for you? And in some cases it might be better potentially to spend that extra money on other things, like getting to places to photograph the wildlife and have those experiences. And maybe, you know, doing more traveling abroad, for example. And the other thing I would definitely consider you to do is to look at second-hand gear. So definitely don't think you have to buy everything brand new. I've bought a number of things second-hand, including my camera body, and very rarely have I had a problem. So let's have a little bit of a recap. So I've stood to the side so I can put text here. These are things I would look at first. So I would look at the size and the weight, the focal length of the lens that you're going to need, the autofocus capability, and how well the camera performs in low light, maybe a couple of other things as well. But then with those things, try and look for something that fits that criteria, that works with the budget that you have. And then from there, I think you can fine-tune it and look at some of the smaller details that we've talked about. And in terms of the system and the brand, honestly, I don't think that is as important these days. The main four, Canon, Nikon, Sony, Olympus, all making fantastic cameras and lenses. Some of those are better for more specific needs than others, but I think for most general shooters, you'll definitely find something worthwhile in there. And it doesn't matter if it's full frame, crop sensor, micro four thirds. I so hope this video has been helpful. If you're a beginner, maybe you're thinking of switching systems, or maybe just upgrading to some better gear. Let me know in the comments box below if there's anything you think I've missed that I should have included as to what you should look for. There's so many things, you know, using extenders, prime lenses, zoom lenses, flip out screens, and so many things. But anything you think is really useful for wildlife photography, let me know in the comments box below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.